So, excuse me, sorry, this is video 9 of the coronavirus pandemic Terminator series talks. And we had left at slide number 39, and we'll pick up from slide number 39. And I'm going to just mention a couple of things about slide number 39. So we were talking about why do some patients refuse vaccinations? And like I mentioned, probably somewhere in next 12 to 120 months, which means 1 to 10 years, we are going to have very good high quality vaccinations against coronavirus from the date of March 24th, 2020, when I wrote this PowerPoint presentation. Question is, will the population accept the vaccination? Why do people turn down influenza, Shingrix vaccination, mumps, measles, rubella vaccination? And in our constitution, we have a bedrock of our constitution called the free will. And we do want to preserve that concept of free will. That's a very important free will. We do not want to coerce people into getting vaccinations or coerce them into any other kind of behavior. So I deeply, deeply respect that bedrock of our society. And in medical science, we have another bedrock called informed consent. Now, we cannot go into a patient's exam room and even touch a patient without their informed consent, nor can we inject them with needles with vaccinations in them. That would be called assault and battery in general population. So we have to have their consent. And then consent can only be obtained once we inform the patients of their rights to accept the treatment or refuse the concept. And that's called informed consent. So we educate our patients on their rights and what options they have. Now, if I was to inform Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of our astronomers, and or Carl Sagan, that would be very easy. These are reasonable people. I would educate them on the benefits and the harms. And even if they made wrong decision, I would be fairly comfortable that they made the wrong decision based on all the knowledge. However, general population cannot be compared with Neil deGrasse Tyson or Carl Sagan. So the question becomes, how do I, as a single individual doctor in my exam room, convince patients that come from diverse backgrounds in terms of socioeconomic status, education, and within our own country, there are very many subcultures, Appalachian culture, Midwestern culture, coastal culture, so on and so forth, African American culture, inner city culture. And that becomes a huge challenge. So here are a few of the mechanisms I have used over the years to explain to the patients that we all live in a country that is an advanced country. And this advancement in our society came as a result of something called the scientific enterprise. The science slowly and gradually learned to master various laws of nature, exploit them, and evolve medicine, automobile industry, scientific engineering, so on and so forth. And we all accept the fact that when we travel in a car, there is a small possibility that we could have an automobile accident, and based on auto accident, we could have injuries, and some small percentage of us are going to die. But the benefit far outweighs the risk. We know the risk is small, so we make these decisions as a society based on risk and benefit analysis. However, and the same thing I explained to the patients, we all accept that at any given moment, there could be a Richter scale 8 or 9 earthquake and all the buildings could collapse, but we still agree to sit inside a building because there are comforts inside a building. Otherwise, we could all sit in a teepee or a tent. So I explain all these things about the driving cars and other hazards and hazards of accepting fluorinated water or chlorinated water. The reason we accept all these things is benefits far outweigh the risks. However, the unfortunate reality, but I've accepted, is that our educational system completely fails our population in teaching them this scientific enterprise based on which our society runs. So here is my request to the Department of Education and to the teachers. Up to high school, all our education is funded by the taxpayers. And since we are providing free education to our citizenry, the reason we provide education is so we can develop some level of critical thinking. And some level of that critical thinking has to involve teaching general population about the scientific enterprise based on which our society runs. And that scientific enterprise is based on cost and benefit analysis or risk and benefit. And we would never bring anything into the marketplace, for example, a vaccination, unless there was not a hugely preponderance of evidence of benefit. And we expect that there is going to be small hazard. And to cover that hazard, we have a vaccine company, a vaccine compensation package also available in the background. So all these things have been very thoughtfully designed. However, in a doctor's office, we don't, as doctors or healthcare providers, have hours to teach our general population patients on this risk-benefit analysis. So my request is to the Department of Education that please make it mandatory that before you graduate from high school, that you understand these kind of basic concepts and these critical thinking and how not to give equal amount of weightage to a small percentage of Guillain-Barré syndrome that happened a couple of decades back. And when patients come and argue and waste healthcare resources and not get these vaccinations, they're jeopardizing their own health, their own family members' health, and also the health of their neighbors. So these kind of discussions are extremely, extremely difficult in a limited time in doctors' exam room, and I wanted to bring this to the attention of the general public. So we train our population to think critically on these issues before they come into the doctor's exam room. And like I mentioned, the Department of Education, the federal and the state departments of education, and also the teachers union, please take on this cause of teaching our students about critical thinking before these students become part of the general population and become citizens, and teach them about the risk-benefit analysis based on which all these uh, items like vaccinations and medications come into the general population. And the other thing which is very difficult to tell a patient sitting in an exam room is, I have 100,000 or a million times more knowledge than you, the patient. That sounds like an offensive statement, but the reality is the doctors have a much higher level of sophistication of knowledge. Our knowledge is on a logarithmic scale, a difference between the knowledge of a general population person and or a high school graduate and the knowledge of an MD. But when you say this very same statement in an exam room to a patient, it sounds extremely offensive, so we don't say that. So as a result, then we are kind of relying on informed consent, which again, how do you inform and get consent of a person who doesn't really understand these basic approaches based on which this whole scientific enterprise and society is based? And this kind of discussion and conversation is not appropriate for a doctor to have in his exam room, but certainly something which has to include to be a part of the national educational curriculum and has to be part of the national conversation. And a few years back, decade or decade and a half back, I was extremely concerned about another pandemic in our society. That's the obesity pandemic. And I had tried to open an educational program called HOPS, or Human Obesity Pandemic Solutions. And again, in that particular venture, I found the same problem that that we have in terms of vaccination. It's very, very difficult to convince patients or the general population to make difficult choices. And again, trying to control weight and minimize obesity-related diseases like diabetes, hypertension, high cholesterol, heart disease, strokes, kidney failure, etc. is not an easy thing. It's very resource intensive and is extremely challenging. And I saw the same challenges during that time. And unfortunately, we are still living in the middle of an obesity pandemic also. But we're not going to focus too much on this right now. We're going to focus on the coronavirus pandemic. And then we're going to talk further on more endemic infections. We already talked about the logarithmic scale difference. And those of you who don't understand logarithmic scale, so when we say that a earthquake was in intensity level 5 or 6, that doesn't mean just one, it's a level of 10. So that's what a logarithmic scale is. And the difference between the knowledge of a doctor and a patient is obviously on a logarithmic scale. But when you explain the same thing to a patient in an exam room, it sounds kind of pompous and arrogant. So that's why we never say that. But unfortunately, a lot of the public good that can be offered to the patients in terms of vaccinations and other educations in terms of obesity, etc., is not fully achieved because patients don't really appreciate the logarithmic difference in the scale of the knowledge of a physician and their own knowledge base. And again, like I mentioned in the last slide, our society has to do a better job in the schooling system to drill into the brains of the students that some deference and some advice has to be taken with a little more respect, including the advice coming from doctors in terms of vaccinations, etc. In some, unfortunately, I hate to say this, and I have a lot of respect for all the service workers, including employees who work in fast food industry. They all serve a very useful industry. So this example I'm using them is not to denigrate them, but to make a point that when the consumers of healthcare cannot really distinguish between somebody who makes hamburgers or somebody who works as a cashier at a hamburger stand. And in their mind, the doctor's services may be 5 or 10% more useful than a person who's handing them the hamburger. And when that kind of ignorance comes into the doctor's exam room, a huge amount of disservice is done to the population, and especially in terms of how to control epidemics, endemic infections, and pandemics, and right now coronavirus, and then eventually vaccinations. And I think we're gonna stop at slide 42, and we are going to conclude video number 9, and then we'll pick up the next one, slide number 43, from endemic infections we'll go on to ecology and environmental sciences. So we're going to conclude that for the time being.